In 1944, inside a grand hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 44 nations signed a deal that handed one country control over the entire world economy. That country was the United States of America, and the tool they used was a single piece of paper printed in Washington, D.C., called the dollar. Welcome to the Market Antiquarian, where history and finance reveal how the world really works. Subscribe to stay informed. For nearly 80 years, every barrel of oil sold on Earth was priced in United States dollars, no matter where the oil came from or where it was going. Every ship leaving a port in Brazil or Nigeria or Indonesia carried goods invoiced in a currency those countries did not print or control. A farmer in Vietnam selling rice to a buyer in Egypt had to first convert his money into dollars before the transaction could be completed. This system did not happen by accident. It was designed in a hotel conference room by economists and diplomats who understood that money is power. The man behind the plan was Harry Dexter White, an American economist who walked into Bretton Woods with a briefcase and walked out with the world. Inside that New Hampshire hotel, delegates from 44 nations debated the future of global trade while waiters served coffee in elegant white-gloved hands. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, who proposed a neutral world currency called the Bancor to balance global trade. Keynes stood before the conference room in Bretton Woods and argued that no single nation should control the reserve currency of the entire world. He believed that giving one country that power would eventually corrupt the global system and create dangerous imbalances in trade and wealth. White disagreed, and since the United States held most of the world gold supply in Fort Knox at that moment, White had more leverage at the table. The United States emerged from World War II with its factories intact, its cities unburned, and half of all the gold on Earth sitting in its vaults. Inside Fort Knox, Kentucky, gold bars were stacked, ceiling high behind vault doors so thick that even a small explosion could not crack them open. That gold gave the United States a position no other nation could match, and White used every ounce of that advantage in the Bretton Woods negotiations. The final agreement pegged every world currency to the dollar, and pegged the dollar itself to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. In theory, this was stable. Every dollar in circulation was backed by real gold stored in real vaults, and every country trusted that promise completely. Governments around the world filled their central bank shelves with United States dollars, treating greenbacks the same way they once treated gold bars. A central banker in Paris or Tokyo or Cairo could now hold dollars instead of heavy gold, knowing they could exchange those dollars for real gold anytime. This was the deal. The United States would keep its gold supply honest, and in return, the whole world would use the dollar as its trading currency. For about 25 years, the system held together, and global trade expanded at a pace the world had never seen in all of recorded economic history. Ships moved across oceans, carrying American televisions, refrigerators, and automobiles to every corner of the globe, and returning with payment in dollars. American factories roared with production, American workers earned rising wages, and the skyline of New York City grew taller with every passing year. But then came the Vietnam War, a long and expensive conflict fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia that cost the United States hundreds of billions of dollars. The United States government began spending far more than it collected in taxes, printing new dollars to pay for soldiers, weapons, and wartime supplies. More dollars were flowing out of Washington, D.C. into the world than the gold in Fort Knox could. Actually, back at the agreed price of $35, European governments started to notice something uncomfortable. The math no longer added up between the dollars circulating globally and the gold in the vault. France was the first to act. President Charles de Gaulle stood before cameras in Paris and publicly accused the United States of abusing its dollar privilege. De Gaulle ordered French ships to sail across the Atlantic Ocean carrying dollars to New York, demanding that the Federal Reserve exchange them for gold. Inside the Federal Reserve building in Lower Manhattan, officials watched the gold supply shrink as country after country began demanding real metal in return. Between 1958 and 1971, United States gold reserves fell from around 20,000 tons down to just over 8,000 tons as foreign governments redeemed their dollars. The promise made at Bretton Woods was quietly breaking apart, and inside the White House, the pressure was becoming impossible to ignore or delay any longer. President Richard Nixon gathered his top advisors at Camp David in August 1971, a private presidential retreat surrounded by trees in the Maryland mountains. Inside the wood-paneled rooms of Camp David, Economists and Treasury officials spread papers across tables and debated a decision that would shock the world. On August 15, 1971, Nixon appeared on television screens across America and announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. In living rooms from California to New York, Americans watched Nixon speak calmly on their television sets, not fully grasping what had just been changed forever. The gold window was officially closed. The dollar was now backed by nothing physical, only by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Economists called this a fiat currency, meaning its value came entirely from trust and government decree rather than any physical commodity stored anywhere. For the first time in modern history, the world reserve currency was not tied to gold, silver, or any tangible asset sitting inside any vault anywhere on Earth. Foreign governments woke up the next morning holding billions of dollars that could no longer be exchanged for gold at any official rate or institution. Stock markets trembled. Gold prices surged in trading rooms across London and Zurich, and currency traders scrambled to understand what the new rules would be. Nixon called it a temporary measure, but temporary turned into permanent, and the world adapted to this new floating dollar system, whether they liked it or not. The dollar did not collapse. In fact, something remarkable happened that turned a potential crisis into an even stronger form of American financial control. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia and sat across from Saudi officials in air-conditioned rooms in Riyadh to negotiate a secret arrangement. The deal was elegant in its design. Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exports exclusively in United States dollars, regardless of who was buying the oil. In exchange, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, weapons sales, and a permanent security relationship built on mutual interest. Other members of the OPEC oil cartel followed Saudi Arabia, and by the mid-1970s, nearly all global oil transactions were settled exclusively in United States dollars. This created what economists later called the Petrodollar system, a mechanism that forced every oil-importing nation on Earth to maintain large dollar reserves. Japan needed oil to run its factories, so Japan needed dollars. Germany needed oil to heat its homes, so Germany needed dollars. The whole world needed dollars. This demand for dollars meant the United States could run large trade deficits without the currency crashing because global demand kept absorbing the supply. American consumers bought goods from around the world and paid in dollars, and those dollars cycled back into the United States Treasury bond market for safekeeping. China built factories and exported products to American shoppers in malls from New Jersey to California and received dollars that it stored in government reserves. By the year 2000, China held hundreds of billions in United States Treasury bonds, effectively lending money back to the American government to fund its spending. This circular flow of dollars became the hidden plumbing of the entire global economy, invisible to most people but essential to how trade and finance functioned. A dock worker in Shanghai, loading containers of electronics, was unknowingly participating in a dollar system designed in New Hampshire. Hotel decades earlier, a taxi driver in Lagos accepting payment in Nigerian naira was still connected to the dollar because Nigerian oil revenues flowed through dollar-denominated markets. The dollar was everywhere, inside every central bank, on every commodity exchange, in every international contract woven into the fabric of modern economic life. But systems built on trust are only as strong as the behavior of the entity that others are trusting. And cracks were beginning to form in the foundation. The United States national debt, the total amount owed by the federal government, crossed $1 trillion in 1981 during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Reporters stood outside the Treasury building in Washington, D.C., and noted the milestone with concern. But markets barely flinched at the number that day. By 2000, the debt had risen to $5 trillion. By 2008, it had doubled to $10 trillion. And by 2023, it had reached an almost unimaginable $33 trillion. Each trillion added to the national debt was another signal to foreign governments that the United States was spending far more than any responsible steward should. Other countries watched those numbers rise from their own finance ministries and began asking a quiet but serious question about the long-term future of the dollar. If the dollar was backed only by trust and the United States kept printing more dollars to cover its debts, how long before that trust became too expensive to hold? The 2008 financial crisis shook that trust in a way that no previous event had since the original Bretton Woods conference in New Hampshire back in 1944. Banks in New York and London collapsed or came close to collapse as mortgage-backed securities turned worthless and credit markets froze across the entire planet. The Federal Reserve Building in Washington, D.C., became the most watched address on Earth as officials decided how to respond to the deepest crisis in 80 years. The Federal Reserve printed trillions of new dollars through a process called quantitative easing, buying bonds and flooding the financial system with fresh liquidity. Foreign central banks watched the money supply expand, rapidly and quietly updated their internal risk assessments of holding large dollar reserves going forward. China, Russia, Brazil, and India began meeting more frequently in diplomatic summits, discussing alternatives to dollar dependence with increasing seriousness and urgency. These four nations formed the BRICS group, a coalition representing billions of people and enormous natural resources spread across multiple continents and time zones. Inside summit rooms in Beijing and Moscow and New Delhi, finance ministers sat at long tables and reviewed charts showing their dollar exposure and its growing risk. Russia held significant dollar reserves until geopolitical tensions led Russian officials to begin quietly reducing their United States Treasury bond holdings over time. China watched Russia reduce its dollar exposure and accelerated its own plans to internationalize the Chinese yuan through bilateral trade agreements with multiple nations. In 2015, the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., added the Chinese yuan to its special drawing rights basket, giving it official global reserve status. This was the first time since 1944 that a non-Western currency had been granted formal reserve status by the International Monetary Institution based in Washington. Currency traders on screens in Hong Kong and London noted the decision with attention, understanding it as the beginning of a slow but meaningful structural shift. Saudi Arabia, the same nation that anchored the petrodollar system in the 1970s, began accepting Chinese yuan as payment for oil shipments heading to Chinese ports. The image of a Saudi oil tanker delivering crude to a Chinese refinery and receiving yuan instead of dollars would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. But it was happening, quietly and without dramatic announcements, in the real world of tankers and pipeline contracts and bilateral currency settlement agreements. India began paying for Russian oil in Indian rupees after 2022, bypassing the dollar entirely and creating a direct rupee-to-ruble exchange for energy transactions. Brazil and China signed an agreement to conduct trade directly in their own currencies, removing the dollar as the middle step in their bilateral commercial relationship. In the streets of Shanghai, ordinary citizens lined up at Bank of China branches where tellers processed yuan transactions that once would have required dollar conversion. Each of these deals was small individually, but together they represented something historians and economists had not seen in living memory: a fracturing reserve system. The United States dollar still dominated global trade, still accounted for roughly 58% of global central bank reserves, and still moved markets with enormous power. But its share of global reserves had fallen from over 70% in the late 1990s to 58% by 2023. A slow but measurable decline over 2.5 decades. Economists at institutions like the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland published papers describing this shift as dedollarization in careful academic language. Behind the careful language was a simple truth. The world was beginning to hedge its bets, quietly reducing dependence on a single currency controlled by a single nation. The dollar that was born in a New Hampshire hotel in 1944 was still alive, still powerful, still the center of global finance. But for the first time, its future was uncertain. The story of reserve currencies ending is not new. It has happened before in history, and each time it happened, the world changed in ways nobody fully predicted. The Portuguese escudo once dominated global trade routes as Portuguese ships controlled spice routes from Lisbon harbor to the shores of India and Southeast Asia. Then the Spanish Empire rose, and silver from mines in Potosi, Bolivia, flooded the world, making the Spanish real the dominant currency of the 16th century. Dutch merchants in Amsterdam built the first modern stock exchange on Damrak Street, and the Dutch guilder became the preferred currency of European commerce. Then Britain industrialized faster than anyone else, and the British pound sterling, carried by ships from London docks, became the world reserve currency for 200 years. Each transition took decades, moved quietly at first, then accelerated suddenly, and always left the previous dominant power diminished in ways it did not expect. Britain did not choose to lose reserve currency status. It lost it because it spent too much fighting 2 world wars and came out of them deeply in debt. American officials in Washington, D.C. watched Britain exhaust itself in World War II and understood that exhausted empires give up their financial privileges eventually. Now, economists at universities from Harvard to Oxford are writing papers asking whether the United States is entering a similar phase of overextension and debt fatigue. The United States military maintains over 750 bases in more than 80 countries, a global presence that costs hundreds of billions of dollars every single year to sustain. Soldiers stand guard at bases from Okinawa, Japan, to Ramstein, Germany, and every paycheck, every fuel shipment, every maintenance contract is paid in United States dollars. This military presence has helped enforce dollar dominance for decades, but it also represents a financial burden that grows heavier with every passing budget cycle. The United States federal government now spends more on interest payments for its national debt than it spends on the entire United States military defense budget. Treasury officials in Washington, D.C. sit at desks reviewing bond auction results, watching carefully to see whether foreign buyers are still showing up in sufficient numbers. When foreign demand for United States Treasury bonds weakens, the government must offer higher interest rates to attract buyers, making the debt even more expensive to carry. This creates a cycle that economists describe as a debt trap, where rising debt leads to higher interest costs, which lead to even more borrowing to cover those costs. Inside the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, D.C., analysts produce projections showing the debt growing to $50 trillion within the next decade, if nothing changes. Those projections sit on the desks of finance ministers in Beijing and Frankfurt and Tokyo, who read them carefully before deciding how many dollars to keep in their reserves. China currently holds approximately $800 billion in United States Treasury bonds, down from a peak of over $1.3 trillion held just a decade earlier. Each month that China reduces its Treasury holdings, it is quietly voting with its balance sheet against the long-term safety of keeping wealth stored in dollar assets. Chinese workers in Shenzhen factories assemble electronics that are sold globally, and the revenue no longer flows exclusively through dollar-denominated banking channels, as before. The Belt and Road Initiative launched by Beijing sent Chinese engineers and construction crews to build ports, roads, and railways across Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe. Chinese construction workers poured concrete at port facilities in Mombasa, Kenya, and Gwadar. Nations that borrowed yuan to build infrastructure found themselves with new reasons to maintain yuan reserves and conduct trade in Chinese currency rather than dollars. This was not accidental generosity. It was a deliberate long-term strategy to build an alternative financial ecosystem that could eventually reduce reliance on the dollar system. Russia accelerated its own de-dollarization after international sanctions were applied following its actions in Ukraine, cutting Russian banks off from the SWIFT payment network. The SWIFT network, based in Brussels, Belgium, is the messaging system that connects over 11,000 financial institutions and processes trillions of dollars in transactions daily. When Russian banks were removed from SWIFT, officials in Moscow walked into emergency meetings and began building alternative payment systems with urgent national priority. Russia and China launched a bilateral payment system that processed transactions directly between Russian rubles and Chinese yuan, without touching the dollar network at all. Other nations, watching Russia get cut off from SWIFT, drew a sharp lesson. Dependence on a dollar-based financial system meant vulnerability to American political decisions. A finance minister in any country that had disputes with Washington, D.C., could look at Russia and see exactly what financial exclusion looked like in practical terms. This fear of exclusion became one of the most powerful drivers of de-dollarization, pushing countries to build alternative systems not out of ideology, but out of self-protection. The BRICS nations held a summit in Johannesburg, South Africa in 2023, where leaders sat beneath bright lights and formally invited 6 new nations to join the coalition: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina were invited to join BRICS, expanding the coalition to represent nearly half the world population. Cameras captured the handshakes between leaders in Johannesburg as representatives of nations holding enormous oil reserves and agricultural land joined the expanding bloc. The combined gross domestic product of the expanded BRICS group now rivals or exceeds that of the group of 7 nations that have historically anchored the dollar system. Inside the conference halls of Johannesburg, delegates discussed creating a BRICS currency or payment system that could settle trade between member nations without dollars. No single alternative currency emerged from that summit, but the conversation itself was historic. Nothing like it had happened so openly since Bretton Woods in 1944. Gold re-entered the conversation in a way it had not. Since Nixon closed the gold window in that August 1971 television address watched in American living rooms everywhere. Central banks around the world bought more gold in 2022 and 2023 than in any year since records began. Pulling physical gold bars into national vault storage facilities, the People's Bank of China in Beijing added hundreds of tons of gold to its official reserves, stacking bars and vaults as a hedge against dollar system disruption. Poland, India, Turkey, and Singapore all added significant gold reserves, with central bank officials quietly transporting bullion to storage facilities in their own nations. This global gold-buying spree was a message written in metal. Nations were hedging against a future where the dollar might not hold its current dominant position. The question economists began asking was not whether the dollar would collapse, but whether it would gradually lose its unique privilege of being the only reserve currency. A world with multiple reserve currencies, perhaps the dollar alongside the yuan and a reformed euro, would look very different from the single currency system built in 1944. In such a world, the United States could no longer run unlimited trade deficits because foreign demand for dollars would no longer automatically absorb the excess supply. American consumers shopping in retail stores from Miami to Seattle would eventually feel the effects through higher prices on imported goods priced in competing currencies. The comfortable arrangement where America consumed and the world produced and accepted dollars in return would need to be renegotiated. Under different terms entirely. Historians point to the 1970s as the last time the dollar system faced a genuine existential test, and they note that it survived by reinventing itself with the petrodollar. The question facing the world now is whether the dollar can reinvent itself again, or whether the forces pushing against it are fundamentally different this time around. The digital revolution has introduced a new element that did not exist in 1944 or 1971, and it is changing the physical infrastructure of how money moves across borders. Central bank digital currencies, being developed in over 100 countries simultaneously, could allow nations to settle trade in seconds without touching the dollar network. The digital yuan, called the ECNY, was tested at the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics, where athletes and visitors used digital wallets to make purchases inside Olympic venues. Cameras at Olympic venues in Beijing captured visitors tapping phones at payment terminals, conducting transactions in a digital currency that bypassed traditional banking rails. If digital currencies allow bilateral trade settlement without correspondent banking in dollars, the fundamental infrastructure advantage of the dollar begins to erode over time. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication in Brussels is watching these developments carefully, aware that its own relevance depends on dollar centrality. American policymakers in Washington, D.C. have begun discussing a digital dollar, a central bank digital currency that could preserve dollar dominance in a digital payment world. But the United States has moved more slowly than China on this front, and in technology competition, being second often means losing the first-mover advantages permanently. Inside Federal Reserve offices in Washington, D.C., researchers publish working papers on digital dollar design, while Beijing already has millions of citizens using the digital yuan. The race to define the infrastructure of digital money is as important as the race to define the infrastructure of physical trade was back in the age of sailing ships. Portugal lost its dominance when its sailing technology was surpassed. Britain lost its dominance when its industrial technology was surpassed by Germany and then America. The nation that builds the dominant payment infrastructure for the digital age will have advantages that could last for generations, just as Bretton Woods lasted for 80 years. And yet, the dollar retains enormous structural advantages that cannot be dismantled quickly, no matter how determined its competitors or how large the BRICS coalition grows. Over half of all global foreign exchange transactions still involve the dollar on at least one side of the trade, a network effect that took 80 years to build. The depth and liquidity of United States financial markets, particularly the Treasury bond market, remains unmatched by any competitor in size, transparency, or legal reliability. An investor in Singapore or Brazil or Germany can buy United States Treasury bonds with confidence that the legal system protecting that investment will not change overnight. No other country offers the combination of market depth, legal reliability, military security, and economic scale that makes the dollar the default choice under uncertainty. When financial crises erupt anywhere in the world, investors still rush toward the dollar and toward United States Treasury bonds as the safest place to store value. This flight-to-safety response is deeply embedded in the behavior of global markets, and it reinforces dollar dominance precisely when the dollar faces its greatest stress. But behavioral patterns embedded over 80 years can change when the generation that learned those patterns retires, and a new generation builds different financial habits entirely. Young traders in Shanghai and Mumbai and Nairobi are growing up in a world where alternatives to the dollar exist, and where those alternatives are being actively promoted. The infrastructure being built today, the bilateral currency agreements, the digital payment networks, the gold reserves, will be the foundation the next generation builds upon. History does not announce transitions loudly. The pound sterling did not fall in a single dramatic day. It faded over decades while the world barely noticed the direction. British merchants in London continued quoting prices in pounds for years after the dollar had already become the dominant force in global trade and central bank reserves. The same gradual fading could be underway right now with the dollar, moving so slowly that most people watching daily news would never notice the trajectory forming. The share of global reserves held in dollars falling from 70% to 58% over 25 years sounds modest until you understand that each percentage point represents billions. Each percentage point of reserve share lost represents a portion of the unique privilege that allowed the United States to spend beyond its means for 8 decades straight. As that privilege shrinks, the adjustments required from the American economy will grow larger, touching wages, prices, interest rates, and the cost of government borrowing. Ordinary Americans filling up cars at gasoline stations in Texas or Ohio will feel the effects long before the word Dedollarization appears in their evening news broadcasts. This is how financial history works. The consequences arrive at the kitchen table years before the historians write the chapter explaining exactly what happened and why. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 created a world where American power was encoded into the financial DNA of every transaction, every contract, every barrel of oil sold. That encoding is still present. But lines of new code are being written in Beijing and Riyadh and Johannesburg and Brussels that were not in the original program. Whether those new lines of code eventually overwrite the original system or simply run alongside it is the defining financial question of the 21st century so far. The answer will not come from a single dramatic event like Nixon's 1971 television address. It will emerge slowly from thousands of small decisions made in finance ministries, decisions made by central bankers reviewing reserve compositions at desks in capitals around the world will collectively determine what the global monetary system looks like next. The farmer in Vietnam, the dock worker in Shanghai, the taxi driver in Lagos will all feel the outcome of those decisions long before they understand what caused them. That is the quiet, invisible, and profound power of reserve currency status. And that is exactly why its potential ending matters to every person on every continent alive today. The dollar was born in a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944, shaped in a television address in 1971, reinforced in the oil fields of Saudi Arabia in the 1970s. Now, in the 2020s, in digital payment labs in Beijing and gold vaults in Warsaw and summit rooms in Johannesburg, the next chapter of that story is being written. The past still has stories to tell. Subscribe and let us uncover them together.